Welcome, everyone. Bienvenidos. This is the webinar on the state of undocumented educators in New York City or in New York State. I am Sarah Alvarez, and I am interim co-principal investigator at CUNY-IIE, that is CUNY's Initiative on Immigration and Education. I am also an assistant professor of English at Queens College, City University of New York, and I am also a 2022-2023 iTalk Fellow. More importantly, tonight I have the pleasure of moderating this webinar. But before I begin and we begin, I have a few logistical announcements to offer you all. First, we encourage you to share your thoughts or reactions with other members of the audience in the chat window. So look below where you should have that option. We also encourage you to follow this discussion on Twitter. You can tag us at CUNY_IIE. Again, that's at CUNY_IIE. Second, please send your questions in the Q&A box that is at the bottom menu of your Zoom window. Again, send those in that box. And third and finally, this event is being recorded, and we will share the recording on our website and with everyone who has registered for the event. Before moving forward, we would also like to highlight 3 principles from our work and which inform the ways in which we hope you too will engage with us. First, no one is illegal on stolen land. Second, xenophobia is systemic. And third, we aim to move beyond allyship to accomplices. Again, no one is illegal on stolen land. Xenophobia is systemic. And we aim to move beyond allyship to working as accomplices. Tonight's webinar is focused on briefly introducing and discussing the findings from the CUNY-IIE report titled "The State of Undocumented Educators in New York." It is important to note that this report is the first of its kind, not only because it is the first time that it's existed, but because this report and the research conducted for it was fully done by our UndocuEDU team, some of the members whom you will meet tonight. So let me briefly show you what our agenda looks like, and you have it right now up on the slide. First, we are welcoming you. We welcome you, and we will talk a little bit about what is CUNY-IIE, or CUNY's Initiative on Immigration and Education. I will introduce tonight's speakers. We will then talk about who is UndocuEDU, or what is UndocuEDU at CUNY-IIE. We will then have some key findings from the report. An overview of recommendations from the report based on these key findings, a call to action to invite you to think about how to take action. Then we will move into our Q&A, and then we will close and thank you for your time. So what is CUNY-IIE? Well, before I can tell you what is CUNY-IIE, of which you have a set of kind of ideas based on the mapping that you see on the slide right now, I want to tell you that communities and schools are shaped and strengthened by the migration of people and ideas across the world. So the City University of New York's Initiative on Immigration and Education creates opportunities for educational stakeholders, people like you, to learn from immigrant students, families, and educators directly impacted by restrictive immigration policies and educational inequality. We aim to develop multimodal and multilingual resources that center the strengths of mixed status immigrant communities, including undocumented, refugee, and asylum-seeking members. At CUNY-IIE, educators, researchers, families, and local leaders work together to learn from and about and with immigrant communities, acting in ways that center our shared humanity, regardless of any status or any issues that impact our livelihood. We also work to advocate for equitable policies and opportunities. And if you look at the mapping of what is CUNY-IIE, you can see that we're working with these different teams. And one of the teams with whom you will get to talk today is UndocuEDU. So without further ado, let me introduce our incredible speakers tonight. First, we have Guadalupe Ambrosio, who is Associate Investigator and founder of UndocuEDU at CUNY-IIE. She is also the co-executive director at CUNY-IIE. She's also the co-executive director of the New York State Youth Leadership Council, an undocumented youth-led organization. She is a long-time community organizer, educator, and strategist. Born in Mexico City and raised in the Bronx, she has over 13 years of experience in community organizing, advocacy, and leadership development. Guadalupe uses her personal experiences, creativity, and passion for education and justice to create spaces and opportunities for immigrant people to thrive. She earned her associate's degree at BMCC in bilingual education and graduated from a BA in sociology with a concentration in immigration from the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership at CCNY. Second, we have Isamar Jimenez-Vazquez, who is a project researcher for UndocuEDU, also at CUNY-IIE. She's an educator and scholar pursuing a degree in bilingual education, childhood education. Born in Puebla, Mexico, and raised in New York City, Isamar has been an advocate for undocumented students like herself for many years. She has over 10 years of experience in the public school system in New York City, gaining invaluable and extensive experience in the many facets of our educational system. Isamar is passionate about bringing awareness and creating solutions to support educators regardless of immigration status, in the hope of creating greater access to a fair and just education for all. In her role as in UndocuEDU, she is committed to uplifting the experiences of undocumented students and educators by highlighting the positive impact and vital role that we have in our communities. Finally, we have Dr. Cynthia Nayeli Carvajal. Dr. Carvajal is the CUNY Director of Undocumented and Immigrant Student Programs. This is a newly created position dedicated to bringing uniformity to resources provided across the CUNY system. So part of Cynthia's role is to oversee the expansion of the centers to other CUNY campuses. Prior to this position, Cynthia was project director at CUNY-IIE. She was previously the inaugural manager for the Immigrant Student Success Center at CUNY John Jay College, the first of its kind in New York State. And originally from Zapopan, Mexico, she immigrated to East LA in California at the age of 5. Her personal and professional goals are grounded in her experience as a formerly undocumented immigrant, student, and community member for 12 years of her life. Cynthia's academic and professional expertise centers on the roles of educators in creating support systems for undocumented and immigrant students in their schools. Her fieldwork spans across California, New York, and Arizona, providing a comparative understanding of the impact of policy and practice in politically varying states. She currently serves as a board member for the New York State Youth Leadership Council. And Cynthia continues to be an incredible collaborator with CUNY-IIE. We are consistently sending back and forth emails, precisely because her position is so central to the work that we do. I also want to acknowledge that we have some people who have signed up for this webinar who are key role takers in this kind of work. Elisa Alvarez, who is Associate Commissioner for the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages at the New York State Education Department. Hector Cordero Guzman, President of the Research Foundation at CUNY, and Ethan Jenkins, Immigrant Success Liaison to Queens College. We thank you for being here, and we thank you for taking this call in to be a part of our team. So without further ado, let me pass it on to Guadalupe from UndocuEDU so we can hear more about what UndocuEDU has been working on.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Also, a shout out to the students that are here. I see y'all, and I'm really thankful that y'all are here because this is why we do this work. I think we go to the next slide, Daniela. So I wanted to introduce my team. My team is now all here, starting off with Carlos Carvajal. I'm looking at Cynthia, and I'm like, Carvajal. Carlos Perez Valle, Laura Pamplona, Farah Said, me, Roxana Herrera, Isamar Jimenez, and Jessica Park. All amazing community educators that I've had the pleasure of meeting throughout my journey in advocacy work and immigrant rights organizing. And I'm so proud that we get to share our work with you all today. I founded UndocuEDU after an experience of being systematically pushed out of a bilingual education program at CCNY. And hearing the experiences of my peers, I saw there was this gap in advocacy and also just data. There was a lot of research done on professions for attorneys, the legal field, basically, medical field, the tech world, but not enough in the education field, and that's where we come in. So that was, the idea is to also, well, we go to the next slide and I'll tell you a little bit more. Yeah, so our goal is to just really uplift our narratives together as a community because often enough, we are told that we are the ones to be educated, not the ones that we also hold wisdom and have so much to share and have so much knowledge, right? And I really wanted to uplift us as educators as well. So that's how we started UndocuEDU. And the goal for the report was to definitely just document. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, the goal was to document our narratives, our experiences as students, because a lot of the times I felt like when we would go into these spaces to just ask individually, right? Like, what can you do for me as an undocumented student? First, you have to come out as undocumented, and then kind of left feeling like confused, a little bit, maybe the word gaslit, right? As if we didn't read the instructions correct, like the requirements correctly, as if we were the ones to blame for not knowing the information. When in reality, it was just that there was no transparency within the education programs. This goes also back to BMCC, all of the schools that I've been, which is just BMCC and CCNY. But even just knowing and hearing the experiences of other students, it was a very common experience. And however, when we went by ourselves, we were never told, oh, someone else like you came before, right? Or you're not the only student to ask these questions. So it was really important for us to just document that this is actually happening in our education system. So that's why we did the report. And in the report, we surveyed around 14 students, and we asked them 68 questions. And then we did 4 in-depth, long process interviews. And we were able to gather a lot of information. A lot of them might be new to some of you, and a lot that may feel like, I knew this, but now it's valid, like someone else is saying it. There's documentation of it, right? And we were able to break them down into 4 categories, and we can go into the next slide to see what those are. So our key findings were that students were facing challenges entering the college, just college in itself, right? Just being a high school student, transitioning into college, and then when in college, not really understanding how to navigate the higher education system with advisement, choosing majors, finding financial aid, and all those things. And then we also found that there was a financial burnout. We'll go into that a little bit more. And the other part that's really important that I really want to emphasize for all of you that are here as folks that have power to change things, discriminatory policies. So there's a lot of misinformation, lack of transparency, and which ends up leading to having a very wishy-washy discrimination. I don't want to call it that, but it's basically discrimination policies, and we'll get into why that is. And the last one is the lack of support from educational institutions. And this is both universities, colleges, and high schools. And we'll go now into what these findings look like. So we'll start with challenges of entering educational profession. So you can go to the next slide, Daniela. Right. So the first thing that we noticed, right, was that undocumented students lack this formal support education institutions, which is detrimental to their high school and college entry periods. We have this person here. We also were able to survey not necessarily just CUNY students, which was a really great thing for me because we were able to see the wider scope. So we have some folks that were in SUNYs and also private institutions like Barnard. When we asked students about how they found out about going to college, a lot of them said they went into asking their parents, their peers, because there was no one in their school system at that time, which when we were surveying people, they were already maybe in their freshmen to senior students. So they were in high school around 2017, 2010, right? So those are the timeframes they were looking at. Has that changed now? Not completely, but it has changed and it has gotten better when we do see counselors being able to even understand what undocumented is. But it's still very much a lot of work to do there. But we can go to the next one. We were able to ask students, where did they find support, right? Because that was one of our key questions. All students necessarily said that they found support outside of their university or college they attended, which is a huge red flag, right? Because we're paying student fees, and this is a student service industry. Why are we not receiving the services? And this is where we get into it. So students found support in nonprofits that were doing immigrant rights work or 2 specific college access programs that they were able to find during high school. One of them was SEO. The other nonprofits that we heard of were MASA, New York State Youth Leadership Council, and Mixteca. So those are the key ones that we found. And they also are the ones that what happened was that a lot of in those spaces, what they found was that directly impacted peers were actually the ones supporting them. What does that look like? So in a lot of schools that you would see in universities, especially in CUNY, there's something called Dream Teams. And it's a group of undocumented students or allies that support the advancement and resource sharing for undocumented students in their campuses. And these students were the ones that were actually guiding their classmates rather than like their advisors, which is, again, alarming. But what does that create? It creates community, so it's not super bad, but it's definitely a red flag. And the next group that they found supporting was their family and friends, and this was mostly in paying for school rather than learning how to navigate it, unless there were older siblings. But most of the support they found was just in family and friends was like finding scholarships and paying for college and tuition. And then the other group that they found supporting is individual educators. What does this mean? This means that these educators were either teachers from high school or professors that studied migration, but not necessarily actually were knowledgeable about the programs that they were asking support in. So there's not one person designated in those spaces that were able to answer the questions or anyone in their specific program that can answer their questions, which is, again, really unfortunate because if I'm going into a space asking about resources for myself, someone in my program, education program should know the answer. Just one person. I'm not asking for all of you. That would be amazing, all right? But just one person. And I don't want to be referred to someone that studies migration because I'm not someone to be studied. I am someone that needs the support and actually needs the answers. Because what happens often is that, unfortunately, even with the most beautiful and best intentions, the professors won't know the answers and don't also have the network to be able to make sure that these changes are happening institutionally. And this is, I want to share a little bit more about what I meant by pushed out systematically. So when I transferred into CCNY, I was really excited to join the education program. However, I had mentioned that I was undocumented in my interview process. And that's when then I was called back. And naively, I was like, oh my God, they're gonna give me a scholarship. They think I'm such an amazing student. I get it. What I did not expect was to be asked what kind of undocumented student I was. And then I asked for clarity because I was like, can you ask me that? And then I was like, wait, what do you mean, right? And they just really wanted to know if I had DACA, if I was a DACA recipient, and if not, because that would determine my continuation in the program and even acceptance. And I wasn't aware of this because it was technically nowhere in the website. It was not in even the advisement that I got into transferring it to CCNY. And when I asked, well, what are the plans now that Trump is in office? And he was very clear that he wants to, terminate DACA. And as a DACA recipient, that was one of my biggest concerns. And I was referenced to all these other people, and everyone basically just told me, we'll just worry about that when it happens. And we can go to the next slide to talk about why that's a little problematic. We don't have the time to wait, y'all. This is actually, our lives is really urgent. We are usually working more than one job, and being in school is really hard to be full-time students as undocumented students or just low-income students, right? So the second finding that we found, undocumented students experience severe financial strain along with physical and mental burnout. Okay, we're already coming into this schools tired, for lack of a better word. And the least, was it not the least thing, but one of the least things we want to do is actually figure out another solution for our issues that ideally institutions would already have or have alternatives so we can collectively figure it out, but not start from scratch. A lot of students experience isolation, are really tired, and are unable to also wait for graduation because it's more money, and more money that's coming from our own pockets and our families' pockets. So that's another reason why this financial burnout is extreme, and like also just wellness, right? And that's why I also ultimately decided to leave the program, because I felt like I couldn't keep waiting for an answer when my future was already in limbo. And I need to make my own decisions. I need to get it done. It didn't matter if I was a DACA recipient, because that was the thing that was actually being threatened, right, by the President of the United States at the time. And even now, with the new administration, we haven't seen nothing moving forward. So where did that leave me, and where did that leave my peers that were also not undocumented? And in that specific demographic, it's a really interesting thing because I feel more comfortable advocating for myself because I have DACA, right? Where a lot of students don't even have that moment of like, well, I can leverage this to see what else I can get. You see what I'm saying? So if you do not have DACA and you wait until your junior year, and when you're about to sign up for student teaching, and you find out, hey, you can't because you are undocumented, you already spent 3 years of money, of energy into a program that wasn't honest enough with us to tell us about what they were expecting from all of their students, right? Next slide. So this is where we talk about discriminatory policies. In order to sometimes even finish a program in education field, you have to go through fingerprinting in order to be able to teach or do your student teaching in a public Department of Education school. Or even when you're trying to do internships or things like that, there's obstacles about E-Verify. And there's a continuous need for proving identification or things that make sense, but can be done in third parties that wouldn't be exactly obstacles or wouldn't ban us from even being in the program. We're going to talk more about the fingerprinting policy because it has changed, thankfully, but there's still a little bit of work on that. There are programs, for example, I think like Hunter or Brooklyn College, right, that are some are not explicit about how difficult it is for undocumented students to enter into education program. However, by not being transparent about these requirements, you're just setting students up to fail. And in my opinion, it's better to be honest about what these are. And if they're discriminatory and that offends CUNY as an institution, then that's something that institutionally needs to change. It is not, again, a student issue, it's an institution issue. Next question. Next question. In our surveys, a lot of the folks that shared about their certification requirements, one of the biggest concerns was how do we pay for these tests, right? Some folks were not even allowed to get the waivers because of their immigration status. And also, this is something, a finding that made the most sense to us because we already see our peers that are low income struggle with this specific thing is unpaid student teaching. The Department of Education and the state of New York needs to figure out a way to not have unpaid labor for this amount of time in general, right? There's a difference between doing field hours for like 20 hours of field hours, 10 hours, to do a whole semester, a whole teaching year as student teaching without any compensation is extremely problematic. Like I said earlier, we're already struggling to pay tuition, and how are we going to be able to find the time and energy to be able to be present and teach these beautiful children that deserve quality education when we ourselves are struggling to even, go out through our day. And then we'll get into like now our recommendations, I think. Oh no, I always avoid this one because it's so prominent in my face. And it's the lack of support from education institutions. So let's say this is the best case scenario. You have DACA, nothing has happened yet, right? You're able to graduate, you already did your student teaching, you got your certifications, now you're in the classroom. Amazing, ideal scenario. But then what happens when you have to renew your work permit every 2 years? The union is also not speaking about what can we do to protect this workforce, right? What is the impact of that in our schools? And also what is the impact of that in the mental health of the educators already in these classrooms? So we saw that folks were struggling to think about what does it look like to get a promotion? What does it look like to think within 5-year increments? Because your work permit only allows you to be working in the system for 2 years. And because there is no, how we have like career days in schools, or we have to like meet other teachers, but there's also not an initiative within the programs to think about, what students have we had that had similar experience with our immigrant class immigrant students, can we reach out to them to come in and talk about their experience? So there's no community being built anywhere for educators, right? Undocumented educators. So it just isolates folks more. And then the institutions could just wipe their hands because they say there's no need, but there's extreme need for these services and just resources. Next. So now we'll get into the recommendations. We broke them down for the state of New York, the state education department, all educational professionals, so all our colleagues that are here today, and institutions for higher education. So the first one, it's not necessarily in order, right? So we'll just get into that right now. It's not in order as it would make sense. But one of the first things that we want to recommend is to think about sustainable solutions to hire educators without a work authorization, both in internship, student teaching, and actually in the classroom. There are ways that we think the Department of Education can look into, specifically look at San Francisco and how they're thinking about doing some of those pilot programs. There are ways that we can advocate for that to be a change. So it's a possibility. I think that we really just need to tap into our creativity to really figure all of this out together. Number two is to design funding opportunities and programs where students teaching, again, regardless of immigration status, because this impacts all low-income students. And three is to streamline and disseminate alternatives to fingerprinting requirements so that undocumented students can access and complete their student teaching as expected. So this is a new policy where Dr. Cynthia Carvajal will talk more about it towards the end, but it's a policy that now allows for third-party fingerprinting, so we don't have to go through, a third-party fingerprinting practice that can allow us to do student teaching either in private or charter schools as an alternative to be able to complete our requirements for the programming. And also, I think this also applies to our certification. You can correct me if I'm wrong later, Dr. Carvajal. And in addition, we want collectively, because when we started thinking about who's responsible for these policies, even the mayor, which regardless of how good of a bad mayor he is, he didn't know where it was, and his staff didn't know either. So that just brought up alert of again, no one really knows who we can actually hold accountable to these conversations when we try to reach out to them, because part of our report was trying to figure out how we can gather the information that folks have in the state level and the city level and in different counties, but nobody really wanted to talk to us. And that also was maybe people don't know, people are scared to share, or just, again, there's really not one person that we can be like, hey, can we have a meeting with you to talk about these policies that are impacting our community, right? So next. We think it'd be really important to create educator pipeline programs for all education students, regardless of immigration status again. So these are already in place. So we see that the initiative for Black male teachers, right? We see there's one for bilingual educators that are doing some student teaching. So how can we just increase that funding or increase the funding in those programs to then expand to all students in education programs? And definitely waiving testing fees to all students who demonstrate financial need, regardless of immigration status. The student that I was talking about earlier was a Brooklyn College student. They shared their experience asking for waivers and were denied because of their immigration status, because I think people think that we are not allowed to have some state funds, and we are. Undocumented students are eligible for state funds and private funds of the universities and colleges that they attend. It's specifically CUNY. And figure out ways to pay for DACA renewals for educators who are already in your classrooms. Why do we have to pay those $500 fees to keep teaching in a school that needs us? But besides that, is if our peers don't have to pay for that, why do I figure it out? I know for some of us, it can sound like you're asking for too much, but this is actually the bare minimum to create equitable practices all around, right? So just something to think about. Next slide. Yes, so this is for all of us. I consider everyone here an educational professional, and you're a community educator. If you are just a student, you are still one of our colleagues, so I see you. And this is to actively work together to gain knowledge, and you're already doing the first step by coming to this webinar, being curious, right? And really mobilizing our knowledge into policy, into changing policy, that impacts undocumented students and educators in and out the classroom. Number 2 is to participate in democratic project of schooling, so advocate locally, institutionally. And I think that this is really important, that we shouldn't wait for someone directly impacted to motivate us to advocate, right? If we believe in education and we believe that we all deserve quality education access, then we should all be advocating for everyone that's impacted by these policies. Next slide. So one of the great things where I really was excited to have Dr. Carvajal here was to talk about the initiative that CUNY is taking to create a position to acknowledge and see us, right? It's the very first step. And we something that students have been advocating for like more than 10 years now. And it's really exciting time to see how we can all work together to make those changes possible. And one of our first recommendation is to be explicit and purposeful about the requirements or qualifications needed to complete undergraduate programs in education as they pertain to non-citizen students. Have it on your website, have it during your orientation process, have it when you're going to recruit these students, because I was recruited to come here. I mean, well, not here, but I was recruited to come to CCNY, but this was never shared with me, right? Have it in pamphlets when students come into your office so they can see it visible. Make sure that all the advisors know about it, so they can also communicate that with students just out of a requirement, rather than the student having to be like, oh, well, I'm undocumented, I'm an immigrant, what are the options for me? It should be like, hey, if you are a non-citizen student, you should read this. Let me know if you have any questions. If you're not, let's continue with this, because this is either way, this is part of the requirements, right? Number 2 is include the undocumented experience in the curriculum, particularly in teacher education programs. I think that we're taught a lot about how to teach bilingual students, how to teach, there's a mandatory class that I remember taking that I was really glad that was mandatory, and it was working in the classroom with students that have disabilities. There could be also a class of how to work with students that are non-citizens. And I don't mean to just focus on the undocumented experience. I think just non-citizenship is a very broad term that impacts a lot of just immigrant, right? So it's really important. I think that would be really amazing. And I think it's doable. You have a vast of educators that have that experience that are really excited to share that. Third is to design and fund opportunities for faculty members and administrators to obtain the training, because we know that they want to learn. We know that they also want the answers, right? I see the disappointment when I sometimes will go to ask for support and they didn't know how to help me. I saw that it hurt them not knowing how to help me. So because of that, I think that it's really important for institutions to take the leadership instead of waiting for their staff to be like, hey, we need this. Why are you waiting? Take initiative, be creative, be a leader, have the courage. And you can offer it. People show up, they don't, but at least people that will show up are the ones that we want to really support and engaging in that knowledge. So yeah, having trainings on how to guide and support undocumented students across higher education programs, not just education programs. Most essentially, if students are in programs that demand a work permit or any other form of work authorization or documentation, which could look like, teaching, nursing, right? There's many, so I think those are really important. And I think one thing that I want to emphasize is that education to me also seems like a democratic thing, that is, which means that we have a choice. And it's really important for institutions to realize that they have to offer us all the information so we can make the best choices for ourselves and stop taking away our agency from choosing what we want, and actually accommodate the choices, because that's what the institutions are for. And then the other part of that is that by taking away our agency to be these great people we want to be, you're also limiting the pool of quality. The pool of educators are going to bring quality experiences into our classrooms that are so needed, especially in New York State. Go to the next slide. I'm talking a lot, I'm getting thirsty, but let's keep going. So number 4, yeah, as I mentioned this before, allocating funds and make critical efforts to invite and learn with other undocumented guest speakers. We have so many community educators who are working in the nonprofit sector and the gaps that institutions can't, handle, that are already doing this kind of work. So we have folks from like the UndocuEdu Academy at New York State Leadership Council who facilitate a group of high school seniors in their college access program who are trained to work with undocumented students from the personal experience, but also from their education that they're obtaining now. And you also have actual teachers in the classroom. And you have UndocuEdu now, you know their names. You can reach out to us, have us guests come and speak at Career Day, There are different alternatives for folks that we haven't had the time and resources to explore, but I think they're important at least to mention to people so then they can themselves see if they want to do more research in that. So what does that look like? One example is that what does it look like for undocumented folks to open up their own school? What does it look like to work at a charter school? And those things allow people to be able to make the best choice for themselves. And number 5 is to play an active role with undocumented students in co-leading dialogue with the state, school district representatives, and advocates for more equitable policies and programs, and not see students as a threat. Students are not a threat to your job. They're not a threat to the quality of the institution. If anything, they are here, they are paying their tuition, their student fees, but they also believe in quality of education and they want to see all of us succeed, regardless of immigration status. I think often enough when I hear students come back to me, it's always like, well, I'm scared they're not gonna listen to me, or like I might face repercussions, because the students are afraid to speak up because they're afraid that this is gonna impact how they receive advisement already, if this may impact their internship opportunities and things like that. So really keep that in mind, right? Make sure you're making a space that's welcoming and excited the students are actually even coming to your office to see you. Next. I think that's it. Yeah, and now I'm excited to Dr. Carvajal, one of my favorite accomplices in this work.
Yes, thank you, Lupe. Thank you so much for setting the context of the report that you all have worked on in ways in which, and very clearly laying out what are the next steps that institutions need to take on, both higher education, K through 12, and even state institutions need to take on in order to fully support undocumented students, as they claim to do in a state that claims to support and advocate with immigrant folks. And so to recap a bit of what was included in the introduction, my role is very new. It just started, I just started this position a year ago. It was created a year ago. And so the effort is to centralize and standardize the ways in which undocumented students are being supported across our CUNY campuses. I'm going to share a little bit of the resources that are available at CUNY and then add to the report that was created by Lupe's team. But I did want to highlight that part of my role is to work with individual campuses and establish relationships with specific campus departments in order to get them to understand the ways in which undocumented students can be supported in this state and creative ways that they can expand upon that support. I think I'm seeing kind of an engagement in the chat as it relates to some of these topics. So budget, auditing, certifications, access to specific laws and policies. And so I do want to put in the chat very briefly, I hope I'm putting it in the right section, some of the policies that we've been able to kind of solidify in these relationship building. Some of them include certification and fingerprinting. Related to budget and auditing, undocumented students can receive private money regardless of immigration status in the CUNY system. So that policy is listed in the link that I shared in the chat. But I see also the frustration, and I hear the frustration of folks in the chat sharing that certain campuses are not doing a great job in supporting undocumented students. As Lupe mentioned, this has been the case for 10, 20 years. Folks have been vocal and advocating, and change has not occurred. My hope is that through this collaboration, we're able to support a little bit more and work together in this. And so in the next slide, I do want to talk a little bit about what are some immediate resources that are available. Daniela, do you mind going to the next slide, please? Thank you. So some CUNY-based resources, and again, this is not kind of the full answer because it isn't a full-time person, but there are at least 2 immigrant liaisons at each CUNY campus. This is an effort that was started by Chancellor Felix Matos Rodriguez, who wanted to make sure there was at least 1 person at each of the campuses who could support undocumented students. The list of those individuals, and I'll put that also in the chat, is at CUNY-IIE/immigrant. You'll see who they are at each campus. Please reach out to them if you're having any issues. They attend my monthly trainings to make sure that they're up to date to like policies at CUNY, policies across the state. If you want to CC me, please feel free to do so, just to make sure that they respond. If they don't respond to you, please CC me and make sure I can follow up with them to make sure that they're responding to you. Yes, and so in the next slide, here the website is listed here of CUNY-IIE/immigrant. So again, highlighting that there are at least 2 people at these spaces that can begin advocating for more resources for undocumented students. So some campuses have taken on this initiative. Queens, or I'll talk about that actually in the next slide. And I'll share the email address in just a second. So 2 campuses that do have full-time people and extensive support systems for undocumented students are John Jay College of Criminal Justice, the Immigrant Student Success Center led by Denise Bivar, and Brooklyn College Immigrant Student Success Office led by Jesus Perez. Brooklyn recently hired another full-time person, Leslie Ramirez Carvajal, who is here in the chat with us, or in this webinar with us. These 2 campuses have full-time people. And so if you're in either of these campuses, please reach out to the individuals. The emails are listed on the website I shared in the chat, so CUNY-IIE/immigrant. In the next slide are also initiatives at our campuses that are being built a little bit more than they were before. So Queens College Immigrant Student Initiative, led by Ethan Jenkins, who's also in this space, and then the Gutman College Immigrant Student Initiative, led by Dana LePage, Serena Hardy, and Jessica Portilla, are also beginning to develop much more resources for undocumented students. But as you may notice, these are only 4 of our 25 campuses, so there is still significantly more work that needs to be done. And I see that Sarah is sharing the liaison link in the chat. So again, just some immediate resources. Please connect with the liaisons. Feel free to CC me to make sure that they respond to you if you feel like they might not, and we can make sure to get some answers clarified. Yeah. So in this slide, I want to talk a little bit more about what Lupe touched upon as it relates to the report and the implementation of policies that are technically supposed to support undocumented students. So Lupe alluded to the fingerprinting policy that has been updated by the New York State Department of Education. I'm putting that in the chat as well. So for folks who want to have access to that specific policy that was released by Dean Ashley Thompson at CUNY, who's the Dean of Education at CUNY. And so essentially the New York State Department of Education clarified that undocumented students can access fingerprinting. And this I think someone asked about international students. They can access fingerprinting. And this guide details out a little bit more about how they're able to request a teach access number in order to then create a teach account in order to then pursue the fingerprinting process. So I say that with a caveat that the fingerprinting process that's safe through Identigo, which is something that is a safe third-party vendor that the New York State Department of Education utilizes, is accessible to undocumented students. Unfortunately, the issue comes at which school, which institution will actually accept those the utilization of those fingerprints through this teach account. And so what I mean by that is charter schools may accept it, private schools may accept it, but at this stage, the New York City public schools are not accepting this New York State Department of Education process. It's unclear to me why. They both utilize Identigo, and so seems to be accessible to each of the entities. But I think what it keeps coming back to is a legislative issue. So New Jersey allows for folks to utilize an ITIN number in order to get certification, in order to do kind of the field work teaching in their public schools. California does as well, but New York at this stage does not. And so to highlight kind of the key point that I listed here, despite these institutional updates from the New York State Department of Education, most educational spaces default to New York City public school protocols. And so even if a charter school is technically accessible in that way, they often tend to default to the New York City public school protocol because it's easier for them to access that background check and that fingerprinting process than it is for them to accept something separate or something disconnected from the PETS system that the New York City Public Schools utilizes. And so that's at the K through 12 level. Then when we see at the higher education level, what a lot of folks in the chat are saying is that CUNY program managers are unfamiliar with these protocols, both the one that I just shared in the chat updated by the New York State Education Department, but also in even implementing alternative solutions. So they're not sure what this looks like. They're not sure what they're allowed to do. They hear undocumented and they kind of, they become unsure about what they're able to do and phase out of the process. And I'm hearing that's a lot of what folks are experiencing based on what they're sharing in the chat. And so with these two major issues, in the next slide, what I have is kind of a highlighting what then needs to be advocated for as it relates to policy efforts, specifically on access to educational field, career educational field for undocumented students. So the first is there needs to be efforts to change New York City public school protocols for fingerprinting. And this includes legislative change that's similar to New Jersey and to California and other states that allow for undocumented folks to do student teaching in their schools, utilizing an I-10 number, or even just being ingrained in the system that already exists. And then secondly, and Lupe highlighted this as well, is that CUNY campuses need to be more transparent about the extent of their efforts to support undocumented students by either explicitly stating that they don't provide field placement for undocumented students, or they must learn and implement the new policies. I provided kind of this information to Hunter School of Education, and I mentioned they were kind of apprehensive about the implementation of these policies, and I suggested that they should then say on the website that they don't do field placements for undocumented students, because it does create this confusion for folks who are trying to engage with it. They were also apprehensive about that as well. But I think that clarity and that transparency will allow students to understand what is and is not accessible to them. And then in the next slide, I think, and that's it for me, yeah.
And I'm back. Thank you so much, Dr. Carvajal. I'm always in awe of like just the way you are very honest about it, and also just recenter students in the process of it. So I really appreciate that. This is a call to action slide, because like, what do we do now, right? I saw some of the chat, I didn't get to really look at all of the questions, but one of the things that is super important is to think about how we can streamline and advocate for the transparency of the fingerprinting policy. And then supporting and cultivating dream teams on campuses. The New York State Leadership Council created these dream teams, and you can always reach out to them to figure out ways to continue growing them. And yeah, we can go to the next slide because we want to look at the Q&A. I think that's really important. Oh, we have a conference coming up. You can all come and we can meet in person and talk about how we can mobilize our action. Yeah. We are having a space for directly impacted folks. You can just skip and we'll email that to you all, because we know that this information is also confirmation that you've been not treated the best. So we can have a processing space for that.
So I think my light is like weird. I think at this point, I think it's my Zoom. It's a little funny. We want to open it up for Q&A. I do see a ton of questions coming in, and I've tried transferring some of those questions into the question box because I think some of them came into the chat. So let me see if I can try to kind of organize some of these questions. Some of them are similar. Jordan is asking, how does a person get into college without DACA? And I think that this is a large question for maybe like we can kind of streamline a couple of ways of doing this. Does anyone feel comfortable taking on this question?
I can do
Dr.
some of the
Carvajal.
Q&A. Hi, I am Isamar, and yes, so you can apply to schools to higher education without DACA or just being undocumented. It is possible when you go to register, and I think Cynthia, Dr. Carvajal, you probably have a much better guide on this, but you go, you register, and they actually give you a number. That's like your student number that you utilize instead of a social. So this number will be your social for the amount of time that you will be in the CUNY system or the SUNY system. If you want to add to that.
Yes.
Cynthia.
Thank you, Isamar. Yes, happy to. Just like Isamar said, Jordan, undocumented students can attend CUNY regardless of immigration status. I know you mentioned like without DACA, how do you get access to financial aid? Financial aid in the state of New York, you don't need DACA to access it. You do need to have attended a New York State public school, or not public school, New York State school for 2 years and graduated, and then applied within 5 years of receiving that high school diploma. Or if you didn't do a high school diploma, but you got a GED in the state of New York, if you have that within 5 years of receiving that, you apply to a CUNY, a SUNY institution, a higher education institution, and you're eligible for TAP. I want to share some websites or some video guides that we've created that can help you figure out how to submit the application if you're undocumented, and what are kind of other informations that may be helpful. So what I'm sharing here in the chat, and hopefully the chat will kind of be saved and shared with folks, is this link will take you to some information on the dream.us, but if you scroll down to resources to apply to the dream.us scholarship in CUNY, you'll see that there is a video on CUNY and SUNY applications for undocumented students. So this is a guide on how to apply if you're undocumented to either a CUNY or a SUNY campus. And so that's some information there. The Dream.us scholarship, you don't have to have DACA for it. There is some eligibility requirements, but today is the last day to apply. It provides full tuition coverage for a CUNY school and 3 SUNY campuses, Farmingdale, Old Westbury, and Albany. So if you're also interested in applying to that as well, please do so. And then the last link that I'll share is for access to state financial aid if you're undocumented. Again, you don't have to have DACA, you just need to meet in-state tuition eligibilities. The New York State DREAM Act is available for undocumented folks, and I put that link in the chat. That page has guides, videos, information on how you can apply to get state aid, regardless of immigration status. And then I do see a question, kind of an additional question to that in the chat. What if your GED is over 5 years? It is a limit of 5 years. However, if you even applied, but you didn't intend to attend, you didn't accept an attendance to CUNY within those 5 years, we can still make an argument for that. But unfortunately, that 5-year time frame is maybe semi-strict. But yes, if you want to send me an email, then I can share a little bit more.
Thank you. That's right. And one of the things that I think it's important for folks to know is that there's a lot of information we're kind of just sharing with you right now, and we understand that it can be really overwhelming. So all of these resources and this webinar itself will be shared with you. If you gave us your email, we will be sending out this information as well as the resources to you, because it takes time. But our main goal here is to streamline and make transparent the kinds of possibilities that are out there for students who may be undocumented and or at a liminal legal status that kind of impacts their education pathways. And related to that question, I see that Stephanie has raised in the chat, I had never heard about TAP and that I could access TAP. So these are the reasons why it's so important that we make this information transparent. Kimberly asks, how do you become a teacher if you have already acquired your teaching credentials but don't have documentation? Kimberly, this is a really important question. I want to pass it to both Guadalupe and Isamar to talk a little bit about what policy can do. At this moment, we're still kind of just focusing on the fingerprinting, so it's still that process of getting credentials, but you're asking a really important question about what about graduation, certification, and then having a job that does reflect your teaching training. But I'll pass it on to Guadalupe and Isamar. Maybe you can speak to that.
I think Isamar could talk more about it since she's experienced enough just working in DOE.
Well, I myself have DACA, so I am able to work within the DOE. One of the things that we learned in this report was a lot of the people who interview, they were looking at outside jobs outside of the DOE. So one of the ways that a lot of educators, they go into community education. I consider myself more of a community educator than I do a like traditional in front of the classroom educator, because I don't have my degree in education yet. A lot of those credentials, they translate into working in a lot of different nonprofits that are constantly looking for people who can educate in math. Organizations like, for example, YLC, who like needs their youth leadership council, they're constantly looking for educators to help support their youth that they work with. Other organizations like DACA, they're constantly looking for educators. These are where you wouldn't be necessarily working in front of a classroom, but you're still teaching. And all of those, so you become what we have defined as a community educator. This is one of the ways that you can. Right now, there isn't, like Sarah said, policy hasn't changed, which is why we wanted to bring awareness to this and start the conversation, because their policy should change. If you have the credentials, if you are already a teacher, because you're already a teacher, you should be able to be in front of the classroom. Some charter schools do support your credentials, so that is something that you can definitely look into. And some private schooling also support your credentials, so that could be another thing, which is why we're trying to mobilize the state education, New York State's education, to be like, well, if these privatized institutions can hold space for me, why can't you?
I think the other
part of a call to action
that I'm curious about the question, Kimberly, would be, did you get your credentials in New York or did you get them from a different country, right? Because that in itself is a whole different advocacy. Not that it's completely separate, because it's still a part of the education policy that we want to push forward. But that does make things a little bit more difficult in the context of how do you re-credentialize, basically, how you transfer the credentials. So you can email us and also like maybe give us more context on that question. But yeah, like Isamar said, the other thing is that we see a lot of folks go into curriculum development. That means that you're just writing curriculum, developing it, rather than actually, or facilitation. So just thinking about those ways. Coaching, there's always ways that everyone that's a teacher can do many jobs.
That is so true. And also, I know we're running short on time, but I do want to address one more question that's coming up, asking us to follow up. Judy is asking, I didn't know that the DOE did not accept undocumented student teachers. Can you talk more about this process of the fingerprinting policy being changed and how that's inviting undocumented aspiring educators to actually get certified?
Yeah, so traditionally, you would do field hours. If it was a certain amount of hours, you would have to get fingerprinted to be able to do your student teaching in a public school, right? So like what Cynthia mentioned, the policy in itself, when you go read, you may go read it, maybe a little bit too confusing. We do advise you to go talk to the program lead in your school about it, and maybe even then come back to us to see that we're not helpful. But in that context, then you unfortunately still have to come out as undocumented or just say you're non-citizen, that you need that that number that Cynthia talked about to get fingerprinted, and then be able to do your student teaching at a different school. Sometimes schools allow, not for student teaching, but if you're doing field work and it's a little bit difficult, you can also, I think, depending on the school and teachers, professors, they will let you do your student teaching field hours, which is different, at a nonprofit that does education work too.
I'm going to sneak in one more question. Madeline is asking, can the CUNY immigrant liaisons come and speak at high schools and maybe first-year writing courses throughout the CUNY schools? Maybe this is a question for Dr. Carvajal, but maybe something for us to ponder more on.
I think definitely something to ponder more on, because I would say that the CUNY campus liaisons, this is although it's a great benefit to students to have a person that has received training and is continuing to receive training to support undocumented students, this is not their full-time role. So often these are individuals who are financial aid specialists or program managers at the CUNY campus. And so their role isn't necessarily to speak at K-12 spaces, it's to develop programming or manage financial aid opportunities at the respective campus. So I would say that I think reaching out to the individual and seeing if they're available or interested or just have the time would be fine. But I do think it maybe it's something to think through a little bit more to figure out if there's some space of synergy between like CUNY in my office, CUNY-IIE, YLC, and other spaces that are interested in connecting with high schools to provide them with this information.
Yeah, the New York City Leadership Council always has programming, and I really encourage you to check them out. They are the most undocumented youth, specifically a high school and college youth focused population. So please reach out to them. They're going to put in the chat who they are. And with that, we'll go into our closing, but reminding you that we have a conference coming up April 19. So if you want to come with your colleagues, you want to come as a student, please come. We're going to have workshops for both higher ed administration and students and organizers as well. And then we're also going to have it's clearly needed to have a space for students. So we're going to have one. We're going to reach out to y'all, and please sign up so we can hear your questions. And then we can also see what that, how we can support with that work next year, or well, as we continue growing. So we really wanted to thank, I can't see the thing. Yeah, go ahead, Cynthia.
Thank you. Sorry, can I just say one quick thing? Because I'm seeing in the chat that folks are saying like, I've like reached out to people at CUNY and they haven't been able to help me, and like I'm hearing are feeling apprehensive about reaching out to liaisons for that reason. Can I just clarify that this liaison effort is very new? The training that they have received is within the past year. So if you've had a negative experience with a CUNY individual, I like apologize for that on behalf of CUNY, and I also encourage you to connect with these liaisons. These they're often new folks at the campuses that have been receiving new training, new information, and they're better understanding their role. So I think I'm hopeful that you'll have a better experience with them this time around. As always, you can CC me, and I can make sure that an answer is being provided.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carvajal. I haven't heard a story from CUNY ever in my life. What? This is the first time. But also, like, I want to reemphasize that these are only people I've met. Majority of them amazing, really willing to help, and really excited to be here for support. So it is important for us as students to also think about what can we try to trust, and then once they don't listen, just CC Cynthia, like she said, CC her. So she got accountability. We held her accountable. I wanted to thank all the speakers today, everyone that came as participants. I wanted to give a special shout out to Angie Rivera, who's here, who is the co-executive director of New York City Leadership Council. She's my co-executive director, a brilliant woman, and amazing advocate. And then also again to Hector Arcudero, Ethan Jakings, Luz Vertidillo, I hope I pronounced it right, Luz, and I think Candy Marshall, if you are here today as well. Candy Marshall, we need to expand and take away all these requirements for the Dream US, because come on, girl, I believe in you. Anyway, I also really want to thank our team at CUNY-IIE, Dr. Tatiana Klein, Dr. Nancy Stern, Dr. Adi Anam Manguer Figueroa, who helped, was a really important part of developing this with us, and Leslie Jimenez, Lorena Modesto, and our current project director, CUNY-IIE, Daniela Alumna, who made all of this possible. And also another shout out to you, Cynthia Carvajal, Dr. Carvajal, for also believing in UndocuEdu and helping us start up here, giving us a home. And again, to my team on UndocuEdu, y'all are amazing and brilliant. And thank you all so much for making, it's not a dream because nobody wants to like do this kind of labor, because like who wants to advocate for themselves? But it is a beautiful way to see that our work is coming together and it means something. And I really am thankful for the space. So thank you everyone for coming and learning with us. Yeah, and shout out to the Dream Team, because the Dream Team is what making this happen. Accountability throughout all CUNY campuses and all state campuses. So yeah, have a good night.